Hey guys, this is Chad Judice, and you're listening to The Art of Suffering. Our mess becomes God's message. Dr. Peter Kreeft is one of my favorite authors and Catholic speakers. He is a convert from Calvinism to the Catholic faith, and I believe is still teaching courses on philosophy at Boston College. I have read several of his books, and one of my favorites is called Making Sense Out of Suffering. There were a number of times while I read the book that I was frantically highlighting or underlining a passage to come back and ponder it, again because of their profundity, and that I eventually assembled them all in one place in order to reference them repeatedly in conversations in the future. For instance, he says, the Greeks gave us nearly everything worth giving except for one thing necessary, which the Jews gave us. It's a very simple and very well-known yet forgotten point, that from suffering comes wisdom. Rabbi Abraham Herschel outs the point as simply as it can be put. The man who has not suffered, what does he know anyway? For if we do not suffer, we're not wise. And if we're not wise, we're not blessed. Therefore, if we do not suffer, we are not blessed. In September of 2008, when Ashley and I received the prenatal diagnosis we did concerning Eli's condition with spina bifida, and I began to walk in that mess in the midst of grief, fear, anxiety, and then eventually years after his birth, on a daily basis, I battled internal anger, anxiety, grief, and many times depression that are some residual effects of several of the traumatic situations our family has lived through in the past 12 years. Those would include 5 brain operations, severe bouts that Eli's had with epilepsy, and grand mal seizures that have repeatedly threatened his life. I've had disappointments about giving up what my dreams as a husband and father could have been, and then fighting the temptation to get bitter over the fact I still think they should have been that way. And instead, I've tried to find the humility to accept what is while managing a career, parenting 2 other children with their own issues, and resisting a comfortable isolation that provides a convenient escape for me from my reality. The quote I mentioned earlier resonates in my soul. So does this one from C.S. Lewis, who says, God whispers in our pleasures, but he shouts in our pain. And pain is a megaphone to rouse a dulled world. And it reveals how dull the person's suffering was, not to their own pain, but rather to the conscious pain of the people around them. Being a parent of any child in the world, in the culture we live in, is really a challenge that can become one of the greatest blessings if we embrace it. That truth is only magnified when one becomes the parent of a child with any kind of special need. When it happens, it's a blessing when God decides to drop someone into your life who has walked a mile in the shoes you have now been asked to wear, and has plenty of wisdom, insight, and compassion that's necessary to walk with you while you're in it. A few months ago, I had the pleasure of reading about another man's life in a book that chronicles his journey with his own son, his wife, and other children, whose plot hits so close to home that his life could be mine in many ways. The title of the work is, When Do I Get to Play? Holding God's Hand Through Extraordinary Challenges. As I read and pondered each chapter, in which I could as a man and father relate in so many ways, I was encouraged to know that there's another man in the world who understands so deeply the daily battle waging in my heart, in my mind, and often in my soul. A battle forged by an unconditional love and faith-filled surrender to sanctifying grace necessary to say yes each day, sometimes each moment of the day, to a cross bigger than I can carry, so Jesus can. Peter Kreeft sums up the main idea expressed in this book with his own words I mentioned earlier, Making Sense Out of Suffering, when he states, true love, unlike popular sentimental substitutes, is willing to suffer. Love is not, in quotes, L-U-V, love of the 60s. Love is the cross. Today, I'm joined by a returning guest from an earlier podcast in this ongoing series entitled Special Children, Extraordinary Fathers, Blessings Not Burdens, and now a published author of a book I want to focus on as our topic of conversation today. Once again, the title is When Do I Get to Play? Holding God's Hand Through Extraordinary Challenges. My friend Brian Watkins is a convert to the Catholic faith. He's the father of 3 children. His oldest is actually his sister-in-law that he adopted and raised after the loss of her mom and dad when she was only 5. His son Logan was born with spina bifida, and his youngest son is in high school now with my son. His name is Lucas. He has taught special education in middle school and high school for 10 years. He holds a master's in special education. The Watkins family received the Governor's Gold Award in 2009 from the Office of Disabilities for Families, and he was named the Educator of the Year in 2014 and received the Governor's Gold Award in 2014 from that same office. Most recently, he was named the Lafayette Education Foundation's Inspirational Teacher of the Year for 2020. He and his wife are the co-founders and directors of the Dreams Foundation of Acadiana. This is a nonprofit dedicated to providing sports and activities to individuals with disabilities. Well, Brian, welcome back to the program, man. It's great to have you here today.
It's great to be here. A nice way to end up our summer before we get back into school.
Yeah, I know. I know. You're probably envying me right now because, I'm envying you actually because I have to work now in June and July, where for a long period of my life I had that little 2-month break. But
actually, call me crazy, but that's my respite is getting back to work. I get the relief from all that my wife throws on me.
No, I believe me, I can relate to that too. Sometimes I think work is an escape. Actually, it's easier to go to work sometimes than it is to stay home and be a dad. Just for the listeners who may or may not have heard the first episode, I wanted to kind of give a little recap from what I remember you and I first spoke about in that podcast. You talked about your journey with your family. You talked about Logan's birth, about your journey from being a insurance salesman to becoming a special education teacher because of Logan and your experience, and you and Donnell's journey to founding the Dreams Foundation that provides so many things for people with disabilities and their families in the larger Acadiana or Lafayette area, which is where we're recording this. And I remember finishing the interview last time, and you were beginning to work on the book
right
at the time, or you were thinking about working on the book. And then I said, man, when you finish it, I want to read it, and then I want to have you come back on the show and we'll talk about the book. So here we are now, and you have finished that book, and you let me read it. And I was so moved when I read it, as somebody who, like I said, can relate in so many ways to your journey. And I really wanted this podcast for you and me and for other men who maybe are out there in a similar circumstance. I really wanted this to speak to them because you and I are going to talk about some things that maybe men don't typically like to talk about in a public forum. But I think as men, if we hold that in, it's not good for us. It's not good for our family. And it's certainly not good for our walk in faith. And the Lord deals the best with honesty, no matter where you are, right?
Definitely.
So I think it's good to let that lay out and let the Lord know where you're at. I mean, what do you think about that? What got you from the point where we were at last time to the point where you got the book finished?
Last time when we had done the original podcast, we were in probably the most challenging time of my life, probably yours as well. We had gone full blown into this thing with COVID. And as I've told you previously, I actually started thinking about writing this book years ago. There's so many people that have asked us why we started the Dreams Foundation, why we do what we do. And it's tough to put it all into words, especially in just a few minutes. And I knew that more needed to be said. There's a lot that led up to us forming the foundation other than Logan's birth. Starting with both of my father-in-law and my mother-in-law passing away at early ages in their 40s. And as a result, my wife and I taking in Monique, which is technically my sister-in-law, but every bit my daughter that you could ask for. But we started the Dreams Foundation. We began doing these things here in our community and becoming parents at the same time and dealing with a child with special needs. I knew I needed to get our story out. The problem was every time that I would try to sit down and talk about or write about what was happening, we were so busy with work and with the foundation, I just couldn't find the time. And as I told you a little earlier, I think now in hindsight looking at it, I think that's God's way of saying, you're not ready. The story wasn't finished. The story wasn't to the point where I wanted it out there to the world. So I realized that. But once I started with nothing but time, it all flowed. I knew exactly what needed to be said. There was a number of discussions between myself and my wife about the way I was telling certain stories. And to be honest, she gave me the best advice out there. And that was, I need to go back and revise a few of these chapters because they needed to be real. Families need to hear what really happens out there, not just families with children with special needs, but other families. People need to know what we go through and why we got to where we're at because of it. Just like you say, the suffering helped us to get to this point in life. And without it, we wouldn't be the same as what we are right now.
No, I agree. And, I'm thinking about, I pull some things from your book. It's a great segue. I definitely think I would not be who I am today without the cross I have in my life, even though it's hard. I mean, when I tell Eli's story, it's a faith journey, it's uplifting, and it hits all the high points, but people don't see the low points. And my wife always says to me, you should really try to let them know that there's a harder side to this, and that, sometimes God doesn't always answer your prayer exactly the way you want him to answer it. And I'm not saying He did that for me, but we won't focus on that enough. So if people hear that story and then they don't realize that there's a peak, a valley in between every one of those peaks, they just think you're flying vertically across or horizontally across the top of a mountain, and it's not ever bad. And it's like, that's not even, I'm giving you glimpses of the good things between like infinite times of like being in the valley going, when is this ever going to change? That's, for me, that's a question I ask every day and the answer is no. Honestly, the circumstance doesn't change, but I think God changed me. And that was the purpose of me being in the circumstance. I'm sure you say the same thing. So I'm going to use a quote from your book. Everyone at one point or another has reached the ultimate question, which is, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? We ask this question expecting an answer explainable through our human understanding. We've learned to expect a scientific, factual response. When no solution to this question is immediately available, or the answer to the problem is not what we want to hear, we begin to question our beliefs. Everyone experiences something terrible in their lifetime. Or, let me correct that, everyone shares what they perceive to be unpleasant. It's easy to point the finger and blame others. It's our human nature to find the scapegoat. That's something that caused what we see as wrong in our lives. We find it so easy to cast blame. It's easier to give up. I wrote this book because I faced that question. Gave up, I turned away, but came back because I finally gave in and I learned I needed God. Can you give a short recap to the audience? Because I remember reading this is like after Logan was born and then the point where you started to walk back. Can you give them a little glimpse of what that was like?
After Logan was born, it was just a few short years after my wife and Monique's parents had actually passed away. We had just become accustomed to raising her. And then here's Logan with all these difficulties coming in, several surgeries, several different procedures that were going on. And I quickly went into almost a lockdown mode, just a period of extreme anger. I was angry at the world. I was angry at myself. I blamed myself. I was angry at God. I stopped going to mass. I stopped talking to God. I physically, I was at probably the lowest point that I could have been in my entire life. My wife and I constantly fought, and it wasn't just your normal arguments that couples will have. These were ugly, very ugly fights. And to this day, I look back on it and I wonder why she stuck it out with me. I really do. And we fought constantly. It was something that was completely overwhelming. There's just no other way to describe it. And I got to a point where I was so dark with the world that I wanted answers. I felt like all my life, from the time that my mom and dad were divorced when I was 3. So there's strike one. Every instance of my life, I kept going along like, why can't good things happen to me? Why is it always hitting me? Why did my parents, my wife's parents have to pass away so young? Why was it a situation that I had to grow up in a one-parent household, relatively poor, and not have the guidance that I should have? What was wrong with me? Why was God picking on me? If there is a God, and that's the way I would view things. And so it got to a point with me where I wanted and I demanded answers from God himself, and I wasn't getting them. And that's ultimately, I think, what just came to my point of saying there is no God. And I went into a very dark place for a long period of time until I decided that, you know what, I am going to get some answers from God or somebody that works for him. And I decided to give our parish priest a call and set up an interview with him. I wanted to sit down and I wanted something straight from his mouth to explain to me why these things were happening and why ultimately every time I turned around, something was happening to me or my family. You know, what was it about me? And I went and I let it all out with that priest, and we still remain friends. um, it was it was a pretty heated discussion for a good hour and a half. And that I'm not going to say that there was a miracle that happened right then and there, but the one thing that I know did happen at that meeting is that he started opening my eyes and allowed me to start looking through life with a different lens.
Yeah, in your book, there's a page. I mean, I marked the page. I just thought it was so profound, the conversation you had with the priest. I pulled it out here. It says, I'm just going to read it because it was so great. It says, the priest and I talked for hours about my feelings. You just talked about that, questioning God. He helped me by asking me a question. Why do you think God allows good things to happen? And that question, you said, caught you off guard. You said, my answer is that if God is all loving, then why would he allow unpleasant things? Shouldn't he only let good things happen all the time? The priest followed with a question, well, what do you see as bad things? It's like reverse psychology, right?
Right.
And well, both of my wife's parents, you said, passed away and they left their child behind with nothing but grief. I think that's kind of harsh. The priest responded, do you think it's a bad thing to die and enter into paradise where there's nothing but joy? And of course, I'm just imagining you saying, well, no, but to die so young and leave those kids behind, that's painful. And the priest explained that what we see as bad things, such as losing a parent, is what we consider bad because our grief and its impact on us. But what about Logan? Why did God allow him to suffer the way he has to? That's your son with spina bifida. Why would God create him with so many needs, so many I mean, I've asked these questions myself. He answered me by asking me if I knew a God. This was so great for me too, because it's so true. He answered by asking me if I knew what God's plan for Logan was. And of course, no, we don't, because we're not omnipotent. I mean, we're not omniscient. We don't know everything, And he said, we ended our conversation with him asking me, why not embrace what he has in store for Logan instead of questioning God's plan? And then you say you walked away with that new insight. And you did say it didn't happen overnight, but over time, that little seed that got planted, it grew, man.
Right. And back to the question of, do you know what God has in store for Logan? No, I didn't. I sure didn't. But guess what? Once I reopened that door and allowed God to re-enter my life, I mean, I hate saying it like that. He was always there, but I had to open myself back up. But once I started doing that, and once I started looking at life through a different lens and considering and pondering that question, well, guess what? He gave me the answer right away. 15 years later, here we are.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of one of the stories that's so moving. I just interviewed you and Donnell for some other project I'm working on to hopefully produce in the future about how to help people ministry-wise through the church with families with special needs, pastoral needs, and so on and so forth. And you shared a story where God did shine. I gave you some light, some understanding about what Logan's role is. It's so great. It's a story you call his friend who had a disability as well, Pepe, and the story of the teddy bear. And I mean, I just kind of bring the people listening up to the speed, but his friend got sick, was in the hospital, and he was kind of gnawing on y'all to go see her, and y'all didn't know if it was okay to go or not. And you went out on a limb and you brought him. Can you pick it up from there and just kind of tell people what happened when you got to the hospital and everything after that?
Logan had made several friends up to that point. He was now in school early on, maybe second, third grade. And a lot of his time was spent in a special needs classroom. And his little friend of his, he called her Pepe. Her name was Peyton. She was nonverbal. She was in a wheelchair and had Down syndrome. But that never stopped Logan because he would carry on the conversation for both of them. Anytime they would be in the room together, they'd both light up. He'd hold her hand and she'd smile for days. And he'd talk about her nonstop. And this one moment we were talking about, she wound up going in the hospital. It was a pretty severe situation. All of her levels had dropped down to, critical. She was in an intensive care unit, and Logan found out, and he badgered us for days. Got to go see Pepe. Got to go see Pepe. And my initial reaction was, well, I don't know how this is going to affect Logan. That's the typical human selfish side. We look at it, what is in it for me? How's this going to affect us? But, on the other hand, we started thinking, well, are they even going to allow him in there? And my wife did a little homework and made some calls and called her dad, who was in the midst of, all of this. And they agreed to have him come in. And we went, and Logan insisted on taking his this little teddy bear that he had received as a gift for Christmas. I was going to cheer her up, and both my wife and I were really concerned. We knew how bad it was, and we were like, how's Logan going to handle this? And we got there, and the nurses and everything were a little hesitant, even though we had permission to let us in. But they wound up letting us back to the room, and we walked in, or Logan rolled in, we walked in, and there was Pepe on her grandmother's lap, and she just was limp, just looking horrible, and her dad, he was sitting in another chair. And Logan rolled right on into that room with that teddy bear right up to her like nothing had happened, and handed her that, grabbed her hand, and just started talking away and telling her how much he missed her. And just within moments, she started lighting up, kind of perking up and lifting her head. And as time went on and he just continued to talk and be there with her, you could see just a change come over this little girl, to the point where the nurses were starting to come in and they were doing their regular checks. But all of a sudden, one of the nurses had come in. She said her oxygen levels are at 100%. She hasn't had that in over a week, and it was just like a whole lot of scuttling between them. They were talking, and we weren't paying attention to them as much as what was happening with Logan and Pepe. We wound up leaving after a little while, and Logan wanted to leave his teddy bear with Pepe. And, her dad was just saying, please come back anytime. And what struck me was when we walked out, the nurses were saying, when can you come back? Please have him come back anytime. We got down to the vehicle, and, it took me a moment, but, what we realized after seeing this happen, this is what the power of love is. And I realized, looking back at it, that this was God working through Logan, just physically showing nothing but complete, overwhelming love for that little girl. And that right there helped her to mend. It gave her the strength to start that mending process. It was just an unreal moment.
No, and it's amazing because I know that she did eventually, I remember you sharing more of the story. She did eventually pass away later on. And but she got out of the hospital, right? And she went back to school for a while, from what I remember. And then you said when she passed away that I think Logan went to the funeral, even though it was really hard for him. And it really was moving for her dad, to...
He actually was asked by her dad to be one of the honorary pallbearers.
Pallbearers, wow.
And that was a little bit too much. So we kind of backed the dad down on that one. But we did go to the funeral. In all honesty, he has stayed in touch with her dad to this day. They're still good friends. And every once in a while, I'll walk by his room. He's in there. I never know who he's talking to, but every once in a while, he's talking to Pepe's dad, like, okay.
No, I mean, it's just, you don't want to make you don't want to give your kid a complex about something, but I really do believe, I mean, we've had these conversations before, that such an incredible gift to be a parent of a child like that, because although we're all instruments of God that bring other people to himself, I just think kids like that, they can be used in such profound ways that the average quote unquote normal person will never have that kind of impact. And God can reach certain people through those individuals that he would never be able to reach through a normal person, quote unquote normal person, somebody that has a disability, somebody that, because like for Eli, he's such an old soul. He's just, everybody says when I encounter him, it's the same kind of thing. The innocence, the beauty, the joy, the love, the gift of self, just the outpouring. It's, and to watch them go through things and them just come out on the other end going, if I was going through that, I would not be reacting that way. And they do.
Here's the craziest thing. And I tell people this all the time. They look at me like I've lost my complete mind. But the more I'm around kids, not just Logan, but my kids in my classroom, our kids and adults that we work with in our foundation, and I see the complete innocence and the complete joy that they have in their lives. Every one of them has issues, but the way that they approach it, it's unbelievable. And I'm at this point in my life around the disabled population, I get a little jealous. And actually, I told my brother-in-law this about 4 or 5 years ago. We were talking about, and came up one of those little discussions on vacation. And the question was, if you could have one wish, what would you wish for? And of course, they're talking about money. And he's talking about, I'd have a house on the beach. And I looked him square in the eyes, and I mean this. If I had one wish, I would like a day in the minds of a number of my students, just to see exactly how they see life, just to have that moment, because it's pure. I really can't describe it unless you're around it all the time. You can't see the pureness. And to be honest with you, I firmly believe that's the way we'll see things when we get to heaven. That's how pure it is. And that's my wish. And I couldn't have said that back when Logan was 5 or 6. I was focused on me, but right now, definitely, I think that would be the best wish I could ever possibly have out there, is to actually see through those eyes the way that they see it.
I'm listening to you and I'm just thinking of the Beatitudes, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. If a child has a mental, some of these people have mental difficulties, not just physical issues. You can't reach the age of reason if you can't understand the gravity of something, the severity of like consenting to the will of doing that, and then actually acting upon it. You really can't commit a personal sin.
Right.
So once you're baptized, you're in a state of grace, man. Like you're in a complete state of grace, and then it's amazing. I think you're 100% right. I mean, nobody knows what heaven's like on this side of the grave, but I mean, I think that's, you're getting a little glimpse of it there.
I think you see a glimpse of it every day when you see someone with disabilities like this. I really feel that those are angels that God has placed in our midst to help direct us and guide us in our lives, because they're so pure. It's unbelievable.
No, it is. And it is an unexpected gift that you get when you have a child like that. I don't want to go to, we were talking about something so beautiful, kind of go to a little bit of a difficult topic for me. And this is me being very, very vulnerable with both the audience and you. When I read your book, there's a chapter you wrote about being a parent of a child like this, especially for a dad. And you wrote so eloquently about stages of grief for parents in these situations. And for me and for others, it may be twofold. Like, you think when you're going through these things individually and you're isolated, you're by yourself. And it's always nice to be able to meet somebody who can understand that. But maybe also for people who don't have this specific experience that brings that in their life, but they have other things in their life that bring them to this point. And they may just can't see how they could relate to people like you and me. And I think that's a gap that I'm trying to bridge here, is that everybody struggles with something. Everybody has a cross, and we all deal with these emotions and feelings, because your emotions, you can't control your emotions. All you can do is control how you react to them, right? And for me, when I read this chapter, man, it just hit home for me. You started the chapter with a great analogy about how you grew up in a math class and about trying to go up and work. No, it's awesome. You go up to the board and like work on the board on a problem. And man, it was so simple, yet so profound to understand. This is how you feel when you're going through these different stages. Grief, you talked about grief first, talk about anxiety and fear, you talk about anger, then isolation, and then finally some semblance of acceptance. And then the really cool thing is that you said, listen, at certain points and certain times, you might fall back into one of those things, even though you've gotten to the acceptance point. People don't know why you're irritated, why you're biting somebody's head off inadvertently. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I had to go to confession and go, I was mad about something else and I took it out on my wife. I was mad about something else. I took it out on Eli, or took it out on, I know what I'm mad about. I'm mad about the fact that I want my circumstances to change, brother. And they're just not going to. So I have to embrace it. And if I do that, then maybe God can change me.
Yeah, I laugh because I guess up until high school math, I was always pretty decent in math. But once we got into that higher level math, I just didn't. That wasn't my cup of tea. And, it never failed. We'd sit there for the entire class period. Teacher would send you home with homework. And I'd actually go home and I'd try it, But by the time you get home 4 or 5 hours later, I've forgotten everything that she went over in class, and I'm trying to learn from a book. I got nobody that I could go, really talk to about math. So I'd try my best, and I'd come back to class the next day, and I really think that she had a target on me or something, but it was invariable. I was always like third or fourth one called up to the board. Well, come on, let's do a problem. And you're like, oh, what are you doing? So, I'd go up there and I'd start trying to, go through what I thought how to solve this problem. And you could feel the smart kids in the back just laughing at you and rolling their eyes. And I could feel the teacher's irritation as I'm writing something up there. It must have looked like I was writing in German to her. And, she'd always ask, didn't you listen yesterday? We went over this and, didn't you do? Well, there's only so much you're going to learn in an hour. And some people just don't get it. And that's kind of where I went with our stages, because, when we have a child with a disability, you immediately, I think every parent, once the diagnosis has been made, you go into grief. It's a different type of grief than I can really describe. You have that grief of a loss of life. To me, that's about as close as I can get to the grief that I had when I found out Logan had his disability, of the severity of it. I didn't lose a life, but I lost a dream, my dream for him. That was going to be my football star. That was going to be my big stud in high. That was going to be me all over again. And that wasn't going to happen. So you instantly, you start to grieve your loss of what you expected. And you start to also grieve over the fact of the things that are coming, or you don't know that are coming for him. And that leads you into the fear and the anger. As a parent, you start to go through these stages at different times. I remember my wife seemed to cycle through those just one right after another. And she was to the acceptance stage very early on. It took me a long, long time. And parts of it, like I say, you would go in, you talk about going back in stages. I got to the anger stage really quick, and I stayed there. But as soon as Logan would have another complication, I'd fall right back into grief, and I'd stay in grief for a while. So it's kind of a take 2 steps forward, 1 step back type of thing, to get to that acceptance. But to me, the toughest part is, I'll quote my neighbor. He said this a long time ago, clowning around, but you never know what's going on behind closed doors. And you don't. You just don't. People don't realize and don't understand. They know you've had a child with a disability, but they don't understand what's happening in your house. We would try to get together with friends of ours that we'd gone to college with. We had plenty of friends around here that were having kids at the same time, same age. And it was difficult. They didn't know really what to say to us and how to act around Logan. We didn't really know what to say to them when their son or daughter was taking his first steps or saying his first words. Logan wasn't even to the point of sitting up on his own at this point, and they're the same age. And it's hard to feel that joy for them because you're a little jealous. And it's also hard to hide that you can't feel that joy for them. So a lot of our friends that we had done a lot of things with, we kind of drifted apart for a while. Weekly barbecues didn't happen as much. The invites that we would give or they would give us stopped happening as much. And we became isolated. We didn't know anybody else to talk to. We didn't have that outlet. Our outlet actually came through Monique and her sports. That's when we actually got to be around people that really didn't know all of our situation, but we could at least talk to some other adults. So no matter where Monique was playing or what practice it was, I was there. Oh God, I was there. And the crazy thing about it is Logan was there too, because Logan is just a social butterfly. So it was kind of that was our big social outlet. Monique gets to go play, we get to go socialize, and Logan gets to be in his element. And that started to evolve. And guess what? About year and a half into doing all of Monique sports, that's when Logan rolled up to me and looked at me and gave me the hardest question of my life. And that was, when do I get to play? It's like, okay, thanks God. Love that joke. Isolation and all the stages. I don't mean to belittle any one of them, but it all goes back to the same feelings that I had up at the board during math class. It didn't take me near as long to isolate through all of those, but I went through the exact same feelings sitting up there writing some kind of a German phrase while my math teacher was just looking at me like, oh, this guy has got he's coming back next year.
I really thought it was such a great segue into the explanation. As I listened to you talk about those stages from my own perspective, I have two thoughts. The first one is you're trying to find your normal again as a person after you've been through and that's what it was for me. Where do I feel like for a moment even in this situation, even though I know in objective reality, my life is not exactly like everybody else's, right now it kind of feels like it. And for me, just like it was the baseball practice for you, for Monique, and you said Logan's a social butterfly. So is Eli. I mean, he'll talk to the wall. He'll talk to anybody. Like my older kid has more trouble, his brothers have more trouble, I think, being social than he ever will. He'll talk to anybody. And when he starts talking, nobody really sees his disability anymore. Just kind of see him. It's probably the same thing that happens with Logan. So like for me, and this might sound kind of selfish, but like I've been going to the gym my whole life. And like when I go to the gym for a couple hours a day and I'm interacting with people, and even though, Eli's not there with me, a lot of people are aware of Waiting for Eli's Reach, or one of the books I've written, or if I say who I am, I do a lot of work for the church online. People see my face sometimes. I know they know, some people know when they know, but I just feel like in that moment, kind of me again. Like I like my life's there like everybody else. And people don't realize how much you need that. As for me as a man, I think too, is like the stages are harder for men, I think, than women, because we want to fix everything and you just can't fix it. And it drives you crazy, and it makes you humble. It makes you desperate for God. It makes you realize your own limitations. Right. I mean, for me, that's what happened to me.
Well, I think too, it is in a lot of ways more difficult for men because, like with my wife, my wife's a CPA. She's on the phone staring at a computer and running numbers all day long. So when she's off work, her outlet is through our foundation. And I've watched over the years, it is so easy for her to form these friendships with other women because they're open and they talk to each other and they say, hey, my son has autism. It's not the same as Logan's, but this is kind of similar. And so they start to relate and they get to know each other. Guys, on the other hand, guys just don't talk. Our talk is about the football game or, wanting to go have a beer or, something like that. And that's the hard part, is not being able to open up to another man and feel their perspective. Eventually, you build friendships, and over time, those friendships will kind of, you'll have those moments. But, for the most part, no, guys need another outlet. They have to have something to get, I won't say aggressions, but get their, like you said, their normal on, something that they need.
Yeah, that guys need an outlet to go where they can just feel like they're a guy. And then when they're around other guys who have similar issues and they bond, and then there's a trust factor. Like I totally trust you. So I could tell you just about anything about how I'm feeling because of the common experience we have, plus because of our long relationship. But that didn't happen overnight. It happened over time.
Right.
So guys need that. They need some kind of outlet where they can get together with other guys who they know have a common experience that they can trust and that they can be vulnerable with. And that they realize if I'm vulnerable with them, it's okay. And I think it's just a stigma about, it's just the way God wired us, the way he designed us.
Right.
We're not, women, it's just easier for them to, I think it's easier personally for a woman to get to that acceptance part than it would be for a guy, because the guy's the provider, he's the protector, he's the guy that, you feel, and this is a selfish thing you have to deal. I mean, for me, I had to deal with it. Like you feel inadequate. And there's nothing inadequate about you, dude. Like for me, like I have to tell myself over and over again, that's a pride thing. Like I'm not inadequate. Like the Lord is providing, for Logan. He's providing for Eli. He's providing for these kids. They're providing for us. He's providing for us through them. And like it takes a while as a guy to kind of get to see that point.
I felt like a failure for so long. I felt like I failed my wife. I felt like I failed my children, and there was nothing that I could do to fix it. I think that's the most difficult thing that a parent will ever have to face, no matter if you have a typical child or a neurotypical child. When your child is sick and you can't fix it. The biggest memory I have of that was when we first had Monique, and she came down with the flu and I think pneumonia. And I stayed home with her for a week, and it literally made me sick because I couldn't help her. I couldn't fix her. And, that's where we struggle with constantly, and I totally agree. I felt like a failure for the longest period of time. And I know you're not inadequate. We're not failures. This is our cross. This is what God has intended for us. And again, I struggle with we don't know what's being asked right now. We will understand one day. Believe me, we're going to understand. If I look at where we're at right now, my wife and I, with our foundation, I couldn't have told you this was going to happen 15 years ago. No possible way. I was thinking, okay, we're going to have one event and that's it. But at least it's something. I did not have a clue that this was going to become our life and a necessary life for us and for other families. I look at, even as we were talking earlier with my book, I did not completely understand why I felt like I needed to write that book. I really didn't, but I knew I needed to. And now I understand, there was a reason that it took me so long to write it. It just wasn't, I didn't have the entire story until that point. And now that I've written it, it's something that it's not just intended for families with individuals with special needs as their children. It's intended for anyone that has ever gone through some kind of suffering in their life, because as you said, we all go through suffering of some sort. We don't know what goes on behind closed doors. We suffer in a little different way because of our population, but my next door neighbor could be suffering with something that is far worse. And I guarantee you I can go down my block and find somebody in a worse situation than what I perceive as mine.
Amen to that. I mentioned earlier that sometimes the quote from C.S. Lewis, it dulls us to our pain. We're not dull to our own pain. We're dull to the pain of the people around us. And one of the things that my walk in this journey has shown me is I almost get irritated by it. Like, dude, you don't have to tell me somebody's going through something. Like, I see it. They're on my mind, in my prayers, in my thoughts. Part of my therapy is helping other people in any way that I can to make their life, or whatever burden they're carrying, a little bit lighter, because I know deep down inside the Lord has put so many people in my life that have helped me to do that with this, that the only way for me to continue looking outward is to do that. So whether that's helping somebody with my job and when I do with catechesis, or it's with walking with somebody that's starting where I was at when I first started. You're ahead of the game where I am. I'm like in the middle of where you used to be. And there's people that were behind me. And now, like, waiting for Eli, the story is the same thing. It's like and I think, unfortunately, in our cookie cutter society and our people, they like brand something in certain things. I'm trying to understand, like, the book is, you don't have to be a parent with a special needs kid to get something out of that book.
Right.
It's for everybody. There's a message in there for everybody. And it will enlighten them to be able to accompany and walk with people like you and me. And that's going to kind of segue to the last thing I want to finish with. You're a convert to the Catholic faith. I'm a lifelong Catholic. We love the church. We love our faith. Our lives are a tool of evangelization. They're a witness to catechesis. They're a witness to self-giving love. We don't do it perfectly. Nobody did it perfectly but Jesus. And nobody in the church does it perfectly, but like there's unintentional obstacles for parents like us. And the last place we want to find more opposition is from the place we expect to be embraced the most. And unfortunately, sometimes that doesn't happen. And, like I said before the interview, I'll say it again now. We can have difficult conversations about race in the church. We can have difficult conversations about sexual orientation in the church. And we should be having difficult conversations about people with disabilities because there is a unconscious, I don't want to say discrimination, but there's an unconscious not acknowledging the need of, and maybe it's because they have no idea how to reach or help people like us.
Right.
And I want people in the church to recognize that. There's a need for that.
I'm glad you said it the way you did. And I told you before we started the podcast, I was saving something for later. So here goes. I'll try to put that out there. So, yeah, there is a lot of discussion that is going on right now in our church regarding homosexual marriages, regarding who can or who cannot receive communion. There's a lot of churches, if you go to different parishes, you'll see a big difference in not only race, but in gender. And those are always the big topics, right? Those are always the areas or the area of population that talks about how they're the most discriminated against. And I do not mean to overshadow that one bit, because I cannot, as a white man in America, I cannot begin to understand what it's like to grow up as an African American, an Asian American, Hispanic. I cannot. I can educate myself and try to see it through their eyes and empathize, but I cannot physically know what they've gone through in life. I cannot begin to completely understand what the struggle that women have had. I'm a man. I can educate myself again. I cannot begin to understand, or I cannot begin to really truly understand what it's like to be a homosexual, because I'm not. Again, I can educate myself. And I think that's one area that the church is struggling with, and they're trying to get there. I get that. But here's where the big trump card comes into play, okay? When you're dealing with disability as a population, I spoke to a pro-life group about 2 years ago, and it was on disability discrimination. What people don't realize is there is a certain percentage segment of peoples in our society that are discriminated against. Women are listed as the number one population for discrimination. Okay. I'm going to disagree with that, because disability does not discriminate against anyone. We have people that are homosexual that are disabled. We have people that are African American that are disabled, that are female, that are male, that are Hispanic. Doesn't matter your gender, doesn't matter your culture. Disability affects more people in our society than any other population out there. And it's probably the most overlooked population, because we don't have the big protests, and we don't have it's just more overlooked.
It is. And, just because you have a ramp, I'm going to be honest here like you, because you have a ramp on a building and you meet ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, minimal requirements for a building or for a facility or for whatever public entity you have. I hate to break it to you, dude, you are not making it amenable for
I totally agree.
handicapped people.
Especially when, and I'll use this as an example, we recently took a little vacation about a month ago to the Austin area, and we stopped by the capital of Texas there to kind of look around and see it. And to find that ramp, we had to walk about a half a mile, but they had a ramp, and they had a handicap accessible door. The problem is that you had to walk a half a mile to get there. So no, that is not, to me, that is not proper accommodations. That is what they have to do. But the question that you're posing is with the Catholic Church. And that's really, to me, a kind of a sticky one, because the parish that I belong to here in Lafayette, it is probably the most accepting place that I've ever been. And I know that our priest he is probably one of the best priests I've ever encountered. He's just very genuine. He gets to know everyone on a very deep and personal level. And that, to me, is what a priest should do, no matter where you're at. But that's not true when you go from one parish to the other. Different priests are going to have their different personalities. And I don't mean to pick on the priests. They have their strong suits and their shortcomings, each and every one of them. Not just the priests, but your bishops, all the way up. I mean, it's just, that's the way life is. We're all like that. But when it gets to the church itself, it becomes very difficult, because we see through our foundation and through the families that we know, we've seen so many families that have left the Catholic Church because they don't feel welcome. They just don't feel like they belong. I don't think it has ever been, physically said to them in words, but it has been alluded to that their children should not take part in communion or having the Eucharist, because they don't fully understand. But that's confusing as all get out, because was it second grade when you have first communion? You're going to tell me that little kid has complete understanding of what the Eucharist is, but we're going to inadvertently deny someone that doesn't have the mental capacity to understand because they're an adult? That's one that's really tough for me to swallow. And I mean, I hate saying it, but we've seen it happen. And we've talked to too many parents that
I hear you.
They're now at whatever non-denominational church because of that fact. And I think what's crazy about this, coming into this podcast with you today, reflect on the gospel that we had in Mass this week. And it was gospel from John, I think it was chapter 6, where they're talking about the feeding of the 5,000. Here's Jesus out there just, kind of chilling with the people. And there's all these people coming, and his disciples are sitting there going, well, how are we going to feed all these people? And we got this kid over here that's got 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish, but there's 5,000 men. It's not 5,000 people; it's 5,000 men. We're not counting the women and the children there with them. All right, so Jesus is like, hey, just kind of chill, buddy. I got this. And what's he do? He blesses it, and they feed everybody. And that's a story we've heard all our lives, man. It's a great story. It's a fantastic miracle. But here's the part that gets me every time, and that gets overlooked. And it comes from, I did write this down, so I want to quote this. It's John chapter 6, verses 12 through 13. And 12, he says, and when they had eaten their fill, he told the disciples, gather up the fragments left over, that nothing may be lost. Let me repeat that. Gather up the fragments that are left over, that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from 5 barley loaves left of those who eat them. Who are the fragments?
Our kids.
Exactly. What Jesus is doing right there, to me, he's given the best possible lesson that he can to his priests, his future priests. Don't let anybody get away here. You fed all the typicals. Don't forget about the fragments. The pieces that are left over is worth just as much as anyone else.
They're just as much a part of the body of Christ as everybody else is.
So, with that, I'm sitting there during Mass, and I said, God, I mean, this is just, they're saying it in the Mass. We have to say it outside the Mass. We have to say this to our entire parish all the time. And that, to me, is where we can open the door for the Catholic faith a whole lot more. And that's, in our front lines, our priests and our deacons. I think I really feel that they need to seek out and begin dialogue with parents that have children with special needs. They need to understand a little bit better about our situation. Why is it that My wife and I are always running into Mass right at the last minute. Well, because it takes a little bit longer to get Logan ready than it does another child.
Yep.
Don't discount that. Why is it that sometimes parents don't stay for the entire Mass? Why can't they? Well, sometimes their child, maybe with autism, is getting overstimulated and needs to leave because it's going to cause a disruption. So I think with them understanding those situations a little bit more, again, they can't possibly know exactly what we go through, but they can start imparting knowledge and they can start imparting a little empathy for our situation. And by having that, then they've got the perfect element to start utilizing that information, and that's through their homily. There's absolutely no reason that it doesn't have to be every homily, but there's so many possibilities where you can educate your entire parish that's coming to Mass about the difficulties we face in just a few words.
Agreed.
So those would be some areas that I think would be a start. The things that my wife and I have discussed for quite some time, you look at every church, we generally have a cry room. And that's for those babies that get this a little bit too loud. And I laugh when I see parents racing out of the general Mass with their child because they're so embarrassed because their child is crying. Go back to the feeding of the 5,000. I don't think Jesus was offended when a baby would start crying. And that's when I go to Mass, that's what I try to picture is Jesus talking to me, and he's not concerned with cry rooms and stained glass. He's concerned with giving me a message. And that's where I think, a lot of things are kind of gone in a bad way, but that's just my personal feeling. But we do have the cry room. And that's for those parents to feel a little bit better and for the rest of the parishioners to not have to endure the baby crying. But if we have a cry room, we're going to set that aside. Why not a sensory room? Why not a room where kids that are still trying to feel out their autism can go, where it's a little quieter? They can still listen to the Mass. They don't have to listen to babies screaming, but they can now relax and still be a part of Mass. In most churches that we go to, there are pews that are there for wheelchair recipients, people in wheelchairs. Very few, but there are some. But why do the aisles have to be so tight?
Agreed.
And again, this goes all back to the education. Starting with the priest. One of the things that I can take it either way, but when it first started happening, it was kind of offensive. A lot of times we are running late to come into Mass, so we'll be kind of in the back, and we get up for communion, and invariably there'll be whoever's distributing communion. They'll come race down the aisle, causing a crowd up at the front, so that because they see Logan's wheelchair, to come give him communion in the back. Logan wants to be just like anybody else. I want him to be just like anybody else. The only difference between him and me is I have a pair of Nikes on. He has, a couple of wheels. So there's really no reason that he can't go up to the front and receive communion versus having somebody race back. And I know they're only trying to help, but in an inadvertent way, they're actually really kind of being a little bit offensive because they're not given that opportunity. And I can't blame them because they don't know my child. They don't know my situation.
Right.
My wife, Danielle, had mentioned to me this a little earlier, but she had noticed that there was a local church here that just did a retreat that was designed around individuals with special needs. Invited everyone, but it was, designed around, our population. And that not only helps them to be included, but it also helps your typical population to see and understand, what they're going through and be more receptive, because the things that we fear are the things that we're going to stay away from.
Yep.
So if you don't know, then you're naturally going to be fearful. And this is kind of a way to open it up. So whatever church it was around here that did that, I'm giving you applause right now. That was great. A great idea. And then, the last thing that I think that we could do in our churches, and this is very simple, is almost every church around here gives a church bulletin. There's really no reason that we couldn't have like a couple of sentences every week. Did you know? Maybe a little small fact about Down syndrome, or a small fact about spina bifida, or a small fact about autism. How many of our parishioners are actually reading the bulletin? I don't know. But if it even educates one person, is it worth it? So, we got a long way to go. And I see it, in so many different things because of my end. And they're only suggestions. Ultimately, it comes down to really each family and, how strong their faith is, because I really feel that a lot of these families that have become offended didn't take the opportunity to really sit down and discuss that with their priest of why they were offended. And that's why they left. And that's a problem, because once they've left, it's really hard to bring that lost sheep back.
Agreed. And I think it's because the priest doesn't know how to give outreach to that family in that situation. He's feeling like a lot of the parishioners probably. This is awkward. I don't know how to address this. I certainly don't want to offend them. And that's where I think, okay, to kind of round this out, because it went a little longer than I thought we would, but it's okay, because it's a good topic. A lot of parishes have libraries. There should be a copy of my book and your book, or my books and your book, in every parish library, so that when somebody goes to meet a priest who does get a poor prenatal diagnosis, or finds out their child's going to have spina bifida, or their kid has autism, and they say, well, what do you have for me here? The first thing you could do as a pastor in a pastoral way is say, I have a resource here. This is a couple in Lafayette who's Catholic, who I'm almost 100% sure, because they put their story out, if you reach out to them, they're going to listen to you. They're going to talk to you. They're going to tell you about their journey. Let me hook you up with them, because we all need community, right? That's an easy thing. Just like you said, putting a little fact or something about that, it brings awareness to it. I had one person, once again, I don't want to keep this too long, but I had one time where I was in Mass. I don't know if they were talking about Eli or not, but the priest in the homily said, there's a little boy here who comes worship with us in a wheelchair every week. I'm pretty sure it's hard.
I was at that Mass, and that was actually Logan, because the deacon came over. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, I was like, This is awesome. I was like, thank you, Jesus. Somebody said it, it's just a kind of a little bit of awareness that, what, I get here, or like for you, you get there right the last minute. For me, I get there an hour before Mass starts to get the handicap spot, so I can actually get him down out of the wheelchair and get him there. And then I'm the last person to leave. Now, my son serves, but mother's son serves, but still, whether he's serving or not, we still to wait for everybody else to clear out, because heaven forgive, the rain open up and you walk out under a covered walkway, and somebody who's a little older is standing there waiting to get in the vehicle. And now your child in a wheelchair is imposing on their little area, and they need to be standing to get picked up, and you get a look. And other people don't notice those things, probably just because they don't want to notice them. But when you're a parent of a kid like that, you notice all of that. We just got back from a trip, and like you mentioned earlier, I think they give handicap stickers out like candy to people. I couldn't find a place to park my big vehicle to get my son out. And I've seen, there were people in sports cars with handicap. Dude, I used to drive a sports car. I'm 40 something years old. I'm in very good health. I didn't need a handicap. There's nothing you can even you can't put a walker in a sports car. I'm not picking on anybody. I'm just being honest. Those cars don't need to be
95% of the time. And when we drive around with our handicap sticker, but we don't take the handicap spot because we know that there's somebody out there that is probably in more need.
Probably.
But there's too many out there that get that temporary, and they're going to keep that as long as they can.
You get out and you're dragging a wheelchair out of the back of the car to get a kid out that can't walk. And there's people walking away from the handicap spot with nothing wrong with them. They don't have a walker, but they got a handicap spot hanging on their car. And so, it's like you just go, okay, Lord, God, I just say a Hail Mary, bless me, whatever. Because, man, I want to say something, but I can't. I just don't. I'm just like, this is not. And maybe I should to educate people, but it's not worth it. And you never know how people are going to react today. That's a living reality for people like us. And people on the outside that looking in, they don't understand that. Or getting Eli ready like you. If I want to make 4:00 Mass on Saturday, I got to start getting ready at 2:00, or I'm not going to be there at 4:00.
And people don't realize that. Especially when you can, like with Lucas, my youngest, he had a dentist appointment this morning at 9:00. I think we woke him up at 8:50 so he could roll out of bed and we could haul down the street. Right. It's not going to take him any time. But Logan, on the other hand, we got to start about 8, So
Right. I mean, if you're going to get there for 9 o'clock, you got to start at least an hour in advance to get everything going again there, and I mean, you learn to work your house around and stuff, and it's okay, but it's just, it would be nice sometimes for people. I mean, for me, it's made me grateful for the things that I wasn't grateful for that I should have been. I feel like part of their journey is to help people because gratitude, it's hard to be selfish when you're being grateful.
Well, I've had the exact same situations happen with the handicap spots. And I used to get so frustrated, and it would, I'd have Danielle over there holding me back, saying, "Don't say anything, don't you dare!" And there was one time, and I'll never forget as long as I live. But Logan, in his infinite wisdom, he rolled right up to one of them because he knew I was upset, and I was like, "Oh God, he's going to say something," and now we're going to have a situation. And the guy turns around, and this is one of these guys that his pants are hanging halfway down his rear end. And, I was like, oh my God, here we go. And he rolled right up to him, and the guy turns around, and all of a sudden I see Logan hand him something. And the guy had dropped something on the ground, and Logan in his wheelchair bent over to the ground, picked it up, and went over to this guy and handed it to him, said, "Hey, I think you dropped something." Whether anything was actually said to him or not, I think that was the message that we all needed to see.
Beautiful.
Maybe next time Heath parks there, he'll think about that kid in the wheelchair bending over and picking something up when he couldn't walk an extra 5 feet.
Yes.
Especially with the parking lot that had 3 cars in it.
That's okay, dude. I can't top that. We're going to stop there. Dude, it's been great having you here today. I want to thank you for your humility and vulnerability and sharing your suffering and how you allow Christ to work in your life for your own benefit through it, and certainly for the benefit of many others, especially the people impacted by your foundation. If you want to contact Brian, reach out to him through the Dreams Foundation of Acadiana at Dreams Foundation, aca.org. I'll place the link to order the book, his book, online on my website, as well as the version of this interview on my YouTube channel. All profits from his book go to his ongoing funding of this foundation to keep that community alive and thriving for children and families like our own. So we'd appreciate you getting a copy of that book. Please share this podcast, give it a rating, leave a comment. And if you'd like to invite me or Brian to speak at an event, pick up a copy of my books, shoot me a message on social media, reach out to him there as well. Go to the Dreams website or my website. And as you know, all proceeds from my writing and speaking go to fund Eli's lifelong medical expenses. Remember, we must boast most gladly in our weaknesses, so the strength of Christ might be with us. For when we're weak, as our children have taught us, we're strong. It takes a Good Friday to leave behind who the world says we should be in order to rise with Jesus Christ on Easter Sunday as the person he created us to be, a saint. Until next time, God love you.
In a world that says give up, I did not yield. I gave my all for your battlefield.